طبعا بعد كل هذه المعلومات التي عرضتها وعرضتها الدراسة، كيف يمكن الاستفادة من كل هذه الحقائق والأرقام؟ ما هي حضورنا الكريم الأسئلة التي تفتحها هذه الدراسة؟ وهل بالإمكان تحويل هذا الواقع والذهاب به إلى أفق أفضل؟ الإجابة مع الأستاذ عباس يونس، والذي أطلق مبادرة الدراسات المستقبلية في مؤسسة طابة، وهو متخصص في تطبيق منهجيات وأفكار وإجراءات عملية استشرافية على قضايا متعلقة بالمجتمعات المسلمة، تشمل اهتماماته الأساسية المسائل المتعلقة بجيل الشباب المسلم والهوية الدينية في العالم الحديث، وهو يتمتع بخبرة واسعة في التعامل مع علماء الدين ومجتمعات الشباب المسلم. الكلمة لك سيد عباس، تفضل، ثم سيكون لنا حلقة نقاشية مع الأساتذة الأفاضل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين. I just want to extend my thanks first to everyone who contributed to and supported this project, and we really do look forward to furthering this work in many ways, and we see this as a first step towards understanding this very important generation with more detail and more understanding. And so, as you've seen, there's no shortage of information in the report today. So I won't bore you with any more statistics, but there are 4 essential points that I would like to make regarding the results and what they tell us. The first point is that these results, they demonstrate that perhaps there's another shift in the region's religious landscape. And this shift may be well known to the people who have been engaged in religious issues on a day-to-day basis, but it's becoming ever more perceptible now in daily life that there is something taking place, there's a shift taking place. And what this leads us to is the fact that we cannot think about religion today in the same way that we used to think about it in the past. And so we see a time, for example, in the last century, in the 50s, up until about the 70s, in the last century, in the post-colonial era in the Arab world, religion was not as visible as we see it today. And though it still existed, and though it was still there in Arab society, it didn't have the vibrancy that it has today. Then we came to, there was a perceptible shift after that in the 80s, when there was some level of an awakening in the region. And how you define that awakening, that religious awakening, depends on the perspective from which you are looking at it. And so there was a definite return of religion to people's lives, albeit in very different ways. And so despite there being a spiritual awakening, the focus in that period, up until very recently actually, was on a different era of the religion, which at many levels became the dominant narrative for many people. And that was that there was this ascendancy of this activist form of religion that conflated religious identity with politicized endeavors, and there was this concentration on structural change. And this was obviously a divergence from the normative understandings and the norms that many Muslim communities and societies understood and continue to understand. But I guess the grand culmination of that experience was felt most emphatically with the rise of extremist groups who act in the name of the faith. And for religious leadership, this posed a particular problem because it represented a new form of religious expression that isolated elements of Islam's entirety and made those elements the whole. And how the religious leadership are to respond to that and to deal with that continues to remain a question that I think we're still looking for the answers to. And so we come to the decade that we're in right now. And it's very possible that we have arrived at what is a third perceptible shift in the religious landscape in the region. And this is the blossoming of what we call the Arab Muslim millennial. You know, these youth who were born from the 80s onwards and are now quickly approaching their mid-30s. Now, this is a person, the millennial is a person, and in this region in particular, is a person who's been defined by numerous external factors, numerous events, circumstances that act upon their religious identity and their religious experience, and it drives them to discover and perhaps even rediscover ultimate answers to what it means to carry this identity of theirs in the modern world. And so this major shift differs quite remarkably from the major shifts that we saw in the landscape in the past. And you cannot categorize it very neatly. You cannot pigeonhole it. You cannot say that we're in the era of the liberal age, for example, amongst Arab millennials, or we're in the era of the conservative age amongst Arab millennials, because the results in this survey perhaps somewhat indicate that that's not the case. And what we see amongst this generation, if we rely upon the results in the survey, is that this generation is becoming more in touch with the more meaningful and spiritual aspects of their faith. And this is evidenced by the large numbers who chose living by Islamic ethics and spirituality as the most important aspect of Islam to them. But at the same time, they're not a silent generation. They're not a generation that remains quiet. They are engaged in the issues that are facing their countries, and the survey often told us that even amongst those who chose political issues facing Muslims as the most important aspect of Islam to them, they too were in touch with the inner aspects of their faith. So you couldn't make the general and grand conclusion that one for whom the issues facing their region is important is to be classified simply as someone who has no connection back to the more meaningful spiritual aspects of their faith. And this gives you a brief idea of the kind of changing identities that we're witnessing. At the same time, this is a generation perhaps more courageous than the generations that preceded it in its courage to call out the imbalances in the way religion is portrayed. So this is a generation, it's taking ownership of its faith. And what we saw in some of the results were that these respondents, these Arab Muslim millennial respondents, were almost in full agreement that scholars and preachers have to change the way they talk about the faith. And they have to change and renew the topics that they deal with in order to make them more relevant to contemporary audiences. The second point that I'd like to mention is that these results portray the difficulty of imposing restrictive classifications on this generation, this Arab generation, and confining them to these clear-cut categories, as I mentioned. And so our analysis of these results, and we've been doing a number of cross-analyses of the results, has shown us that this is a generation that blurs the line of conventional thinking on issues of religious reform, or what is known as religious reform, renewal of religion, the role of religion, and the efficacy of religion in contributing to people's lives and the societies that they live in. So, like Jim mentioned earlier, they did not buy into the idea of changing their religion. That was not an issue for them. But they did want to see a change in the way religion is portrayed and the means that are used in order to take religion out into the public space. As we saw, they have the confidence to be one to known as Muslims. There's a sense of courage there that they want others to know that they're Muslim. That question wasn't asking, do you want to be seen as a Muslim amongst yourself, but it was asking, to what extent do you want others to look at you as a Muslim, right? And the results are striking because it was in the majority. Despite that, as was mentioned in the results, they are still facing a tension between preserving that identity, that religious identity, that religious center that they have, and the developments and changes in the societies that they live in. Now, that doesn't have to be an issue in essence, because everyone lives some degree of tension in their faith and within their lives. But the question is, to what degree does it become a grievance and a discontent that can therefore go on to be exploited? They were quite emphatic. This generation, again, challenging our assumptions about this generation, they were quite emphatic about believing that religion did not cause or was not a causative reason for the decline of the region. Religion was not a major cause for that. And many of them saw a very positive role that religion can play in building their country's futures. Now, the limitations of the survey are that we can't ask, or we don't know what that role is. But that's something, I think, for religious and policy leadership in the region is something to explore. The third point I want to come to is that some of the results in the survey and the general kind of understanding that we walk away with raises very consequential questions for religious and policy leadership in the region. And what we see in some of these responses is that this generation is bringing out to the fore, right? Is bringing out the fact that there are some very root issues at the grassroots level, and these are issues which mold and formulate, religious experience and identity on a day-to-day basis. These issues need to be understood. They need to be addressed, and they need to be attended to. Because it's at that level, at that grassroots level, that everyday experience that you have with your faith, away from the big news items and everything that's taking place around them, it's at that level that your faith is being defined, and it's being enhanced, and it's being enriched. And so if the various leaderships in the region want to turn the page on the exploitation of religion in the region, then attention has to be paid to these root issues. And amongst these root issues, we've seen that there was a very high recognition of the ulama, or the religious scholars, as being the rightful authorities on religion. That many of the youth saw, whether it was the Grand Mufti of their country or whether it was qualified religious scholars, as being the rightful authorities who could explain religion, who could understand religion, and who could issue edicts, religious edicts in the religion. But at the same time, despite this high trust that they have in the scholars, there was a low level of interest in understanding their faith, in seeking knowledge. And likewise, when we ask them the question, where do you go to when you have a question? You have a question about your faith, who do you go to? Religious scholars and the fatwa centers, which house many of the religious scholars and which are places in the region which are set up in order to answer these questions, they come down further in the list. So they recognize the authority of scholars, but they're not necessarily going to the scholars for the answers to the question. And this is something that the religious leadership needs to think about and analyze and assess and understand. Likewise, we saw that notable numbers found the Friday sermon somewhat ineffective. And even though in other questions, as you can see in the report, they said that they don't necessarily go to the Friday sermon for guidance or direction, the sermon is still the one place at the center of religious life, which attracts the most broadest cross-section of the society. And therefore, people from all types and backgrounds will attend the mosque on a Friday, and they will listen to whatever is being said. And the importance of that cannot be overstated. Lastly, I'd like to finish by just stating that what we take away from these results is that they demonstrate the value, the significance, and the need for creating a knowledge base of more evidence-based insights into this generation and the religious experience of the region's societies. We need this so that we are in a better state of comprehension and understanding and appreciation of what faces this generation. And at the same time, no intervention in the region, no solution can be based upon assumption. And I'll close with something that one of the great theologians and philosophers of Islam said, Al-Ghazali, that the worst condition for a human being to be in is to not know, and not know that they don't know. Thank you very much.